Thanks for having me today, guys, and thanks for being here and braving the weather. But we'll get started. And, the title of my presentation is Movements, Home Range, and Habitat Selection of Stock Age 1 Muskellunge in Eagle Creek Reservoir. And this is not the original project or path I was going to go with my thesis, but I'll go into more details why we actually got to this project more into the presentation. But first off, we'll start off with a little background information. So for those of you who are not familiar where Eagle Creek Reservoir is, it's just right down the road from here, basically. It's about 10 miles northwest of downtown Indianapolis. It was constructed in 1968 because of a series of floods that happened in the mid-1950s. And however, it's mainly used as a water supply now for the city of Indianapolis and Speedway. It's about 1,350 acres in size. It's got an average depth of almost 12 feet. The reservoir is divided into the northern and southern half by the 56th Street Causeway. And there's a variety of recreational boating, such as college and university rowing competitions. There's even a sailboat race every Wednesday night throughout the summer. And the reservoir is very popular in the city of Indianapolis, as it provides nearly 1.1 million people with nearby fishing opportunities. It supports a variety of sport fishes such as largemouth bass, white crappie, channel catfish, bluegill. And the DNR recently has found out that there's a large population of gizzard shad that are having a negative effect on these fishes. And as an effort, the DNR would like to try to reduce these numbers and densities of these gizzard shad in order to possibly allow the fish populations to become more balanced. But they can't use chemical control methods such as rotenone because it is a water supply, and poisoning the water supply will really be frowned upon in that kind of sense. So they have to resort to a biological control such as stocking predator fish. And recently they've been stocking walleye, and they discontinued hybrid striped bass because they weren't doing so hot, and along with northern pike in the 80s, they also discontinued that. But in 2011, as we all know, they started stocking muskie at 1 per acre. And if you guys, hopefully you guys know this, they are a popular sport fish, and they, however, do have some negative publicity with the largemouth bass fishermen and walleye fishermen because they think stocking the muskies, that they're going to go in there and eat all their fish, and there's going to be no fish left. It's just going to be muskies. However, that is not true. They are very useful and have been proven very useful in reducing densities of undesired fish, such as gizzard shad and common carp. And with this angler concern, this actually brought my original question to the project. So, how are the stock muskellunge actually affecting the fishery? Are they eating all the largemouth bass, all the bluegill, or are they actually reducing the gizzard shad numbers and actually improving the fishery? And in order to do that, we followed Indiana DNR protocol and set gill nets, trap nets, and had nighttime electrofishing. And we did surveys for 3 years from 2012 to 2014. And for every fish that we collected, we took lengths, and for all sport fishes, we took weights. And just the results of this study, we found during the 3 years that the gizzard shad are definitely having a negative effect on the fishery. Bluegill populations were very stunted. We didn't get a bluegill hardly over 6 inches during all 3 years. And over the 3 years, we did collect over 8,000 fish. 2,500 of them were nearly gizzard shad. And for example, we caught only 150 walleye. But for the muskie, our numbers were kind of lacking. And so this kind of left us scratching our heads saying, well, how are we going to determine if they're affecting the fishery if we don't even catch them? So we sat there, we looked up some data, and we actually found that this is a common occurrence, that newly stocked muskie in a reservoir, like some of these fish were only 3 to 4 years at max of age, that these younger fish aren't typically collected in typical fisheries equipment such as the gill nets or trap nets. So that kind of left us with the question now, well, where are these fish? Why aren't we catching them? And a great tool to actually answer a lot of management questions and research questions is radio telemetry, as it provides the exact location of fish. We can track at any time, and radio telemetry is very useful in that you can actually track from the air, like in a helicopter. You can track from a boat, as pictured here, or you can even just stand on the shore and track from the shoreline. However, that's one big plus for that over acoustic telemetry, which you have to have a little microphone and actually stick the microphone in the water. So you're very limited in what you can do there. And radio telemetry has been used since the 1960s to actually track fish in fresh water. And it's been very, very heavily used in tracking adult muskellunge. However, it's been very, very limited in the younger juvenile fish or subadult fish, as there only have been 2 other studies since the development of radio telemetry that have actually looked at age 1 muskellunge. So that's what we were trying to do here. And our objectives for this study were to determine the movements. So where are the fish moving? Are they swimming around the entire reservoir? Are they leaving the reservoir? And with movements, we can also determine home range size. And when I'm referring to home range size, we're not talking about territory or anything like that. A home range size encompasses the entire area for which an organism needs to complete all of its biological processes. So breeding, feeding, just everything. And also look at habitat selection. So what kind of habitat are these fish keen on? Are they even keen on any specific type of habitat? So these are all a lot of lingering questions that have not been answered with this really lack of literature about this subject. And in order to do this, we acquired 40 age 1 muskellunge from the DNR. They were the broodstock from Webster Lake, and they were held over the winter, and we actually implanted the tags in the spring. And the tags weighed only 0.1 ounces, and so they were very light tags. They had an antenna length of only 4 inches. Their pulse rate, or beeps per minute, were 30, so there was a beep every 2 seconds when we were listening in our headphones. And they had a battery cap life of 257 days. And the average length of the fish were only 11.5 inches and had a weight of 4.2 ounces. So they were very, very small, but clever. And when it is recommended that when inserting or surgically implanting radio tags, that the tag cannot be more than 5% of the fish's weight, which we were at 3% of these, so we were well within that, under that weight. As if tags are generally over 5% of the fish's weight, they will alter behavior or even movement of the fish. And the fish were held for 2 days in the hatchery to ensure recovery, and then were stocked in March of 2014 on the northern half of the reservoir. Tracking took place weekly from March until just last December. And once a fish was tracked, we took water depth, we took note of habitat, and we categorized habitat into very broad habitat types. And they were vegetation, timber, artificial, which included the docks, that kind of thing, boulders, and sand/muck. And also, additionally, the GPS location was also taken. And to calculate movements of the fishes, we just took the GPS points, and every time during each week that the fish moved, we just basically took as the crow flies and just recorded that distance between each 2 points. And for the home ranges, we actually had to track the fish at least 5 times, and we were looking at each season in which the home ranges varied. So we actually had to track each fish 5 times in each of the seasons, in which from March to December, that included the 3 seasons: spring, summer, and fall. So we needed to track the fish hopefully around 15 times. And for habitat, in order to actually answer the habitat selection, we actually had to do a habitat survey of the entire reservoir. And to do this, we actually traveled around the entire length of the reservoir, which ended up to be about 20 miles of driving around. And every time there was a natural contour of the shoreline that changed, or an actual habitat that severe habitat change, we always would mark the GPS point and mark another GPS point, and then we'd actually measure that distance in between and estimate how far this habitat, like say the timber, how far this timber actually came into the reservoir, and just kind of got a general area and amount for the reservoir. And to actually determine the habitat selection of these fish, we actually used a simple equation that is called Jacob's index, and it looks a little bit fun, but the R is basically just a proportion of a certain habitat. So let's just say timber. It's the amount of timber or proportion of timber within a specific home range of an individual muskie. So we could actually use the home ranges that we calculated before and just apply it there. So anytime the home range overlapped timber in the reservoir, it was considered, we measured that amount within that home range. And then P is simply just the total amount of timber in the reservoir. And the values that this equation will spit out for us vary from -1 to +1. -1 meaning that there's a strong avoidance, or the muskie basically did not select that habitat type. And +1 means that they actually did select it and had a preference for that habitat type. And the results of this study, we found 312 confirmed locations of muskie throughout the entire tracking period. It lasted for over 260 days, which was about 34 weeks. And we actually had, if you were following the blog, we actually had, you know that some of the fish actually traveled almost 3 miles upstream of the reservoir in Eagle Creek, and also went into a nearby gravel pit. But for the most part, the fish that actually remained in the reservoir were very, very close to shore. And I got a little video, just kind of a demonstration of us actually tracking and what it's like to actually sit there and listen to the beeps. And if you can't hear in the back, I'll tell you when it beeps. But this is actually when we were actually tracking one of the fish in the Eagle Creek. Beep for me, I guess. Well, I guess the sound doesn't work on that, but it'll actually just beep every 2 seconds. You'll be able to, and as you actually got closer to the fish, the beeps would get louder, and there's like a little meter on the receiver that actually will show you the actual signal strength, so you'll know when you're actually getting close to it. And the results of the movements, we actually found that movements varied for each week. They varied from just on average 26 yards to about 1,500 yards, depending on the week. But most of that variation was during the spring. However, in the summer, the variation was only about 50 yards to at max, but it was generally from that 25 to 50 yard range. So there was very little movement for the spring, and with the fall, it was very similar to the spring also, with each week depending on the weather and that such, that movements varied from 25 yards to about 1,000 yards. So there was a lot of movement. And we also actually found out that there were a lot of environmental variables that actually influence movement. So movements tended to be higher when water depth increased. So the fish was in deeper water, the movements tend to be a lot more than when the fish was along shore. And also, wind speed had a lot to do with that. It was one of our strongest influences of movement. So this could be with the fish being so close to shore that a lot of the wave action, the turbidity being kind of stirred up in the water and increased, that visibility is probably very poor, and with the fish being, again, so small and on shore, that the wave action mainly could be impeding movement. So as a result, to kind of just save themselves from being washed on shore, they would actually move farther out into the reservoir just to avoid this and kind of protect themselves from that. And also, dissolved oxygen was a huge influence. So the higher the dissolved oxygen content, the more movement there was. So again, that was related to could be the result of the thermocline being a formation during the summer could actually reduce that. So during the spring and fall, that typically oxygen are higher levels, so therefore higher movement. And this is very similar with the adults also. And however, some factors that decrease movement were water clarity. So when water clarity actually increased and you could actually see easier, movement was just very, very low. And this could be due to also, they can see since there are line weight predators, there's no need to move. They can just sit and wait for the fish to swim by, or a gizzard shad or something like that to swim by. And as opposed to when the water is very muddy or turbid, that they would not be able to see the fish very well, so they'd actually have to go out and search for food, and so on and so forth. And another thing that additionally could be suggested, and has been suggested in a lot of literature, since these fish are only 11.5 inches, and they're so close to shore, they'd be very, very vulnerable to predation. And if they were moving along shore, a lot of like blue herons and such could actually prey on these fish. So this could actually be a very effective way of predator avoidance, by basically just remaining in one spot and hiding under a log. And also we found, again, during the summer, that movements were very low. And so the results of home ranges, for the spring, there were a lot of variations in fish home ranges. Like this home range was actually 150 acres and covered most of the southern half of the reservoir. However, another guy, his home range was only 4 acres and was very small. So there was just a lot of variability. So there could be a number of factors influencing why there's such variation. And they're individually because, as you can see, when you pile them all together, it's very difficult to read. And over the spring, we actually were able to calculate 16 home ranges, and which does mean that we were able to track fish, 16 fish at least 5 times. For the summer, and the arrows are pointing at home ranges. Home ranges were very, very small, so the fish basically just did not move at all. And these little bitty home ranges that the arrows are pointing to, these were 1 to 2 acres, so there was not a lot of movement at all during the summer. And we were also able to track 6 fish during this time. And for the fall, home ranges for the fish that we had remaining in the reservoir were actually a little larger, but not quite as large as they were in the spring. But there was still one muskie that actually had a very small home range. And this is actually just kind of a summary of it and kind of the number of fish we collected also. And as you know, if you've been reading the blog also, during the last week in April, we actually lost over half of our fish after a large storm event. And these fish could have went through the dam, because as we were tracking the fish that actually went to the southern end of the reservoir, every week that one of them would go to the southern reservoir and we track the southern end of the reservoir and we would track them there, the next week they were gone. So chances are they went through the dam, got preyed on, and so or something like that. Also, even some of the ones on the northern end were being lost and disappearing, in which we eventually found 6 of them that actually went upstream and 2 that went to a nearby gravel pit. So there was a lot of just of the fish leaving the reservoir, and this is a big problem when it comes to actually managing the fishery and trying to establish well-established and balanced population in the reservoir. So kind of this is the result of the habitat survey, and most of the habitat, or the typical habitat that you think for a muskie, such as timber or vegetation, is all located on the northern half of the reservoir, and there is little habitat located on the southern reservoir, or southern half of the reservoir for these fish. So the result of all this habitat actually being on the northern edge of the reservoir could be simply that with Eagle Creek flowing from the north end of the reservoir and flowing south, that a lot of the debris and woody debris that is collected in the stream actually will collect along shore along the northern end, but really won't travel to the south end because of the causeway is blocking most of that habitat. And also the southern half of the Eagle Creek has some residential housing and a lot of riprap along the edges, so a lot of people are probably clearing out this timber and removing it just so they can park their boat at their dock and such. And this is could be having a big influence on the muskie, as the home range has shown that a lot of the fish were remaining on the northern half of the reservoir throughout the entire tracking period. And this is just a general summary of the acreage of each thing and each habitat type, and it has shown that less than 5%, so 4.2% of the reservoir is this typical vegetation and timber habitat for muskie. And this could be a big problem, as it could create a lot of competition among these muskie being stocked in the reservoir, and possibly even causing some of them to leave the reservoir. And the result of the habitat selection, we found that muskie definitely select timber over any other of the habitat types that we had. So timber is a very important habitat for these muskie. And as there's not a lot of vegetation, there was really not much selection of vegetation, or not much really shown in the calculations. But however, boulders and sand/muck were very highly avoided by the muskie. However, in artificial, you can, for the spring, you notice how there's a slight preference for it. This could be the result of during the spring, there were a lot of fish that were found on the southern end. And it may have only been for a couple weeks, but they were found on the southern end. And with there not being a lot of habitat or timber and vegetation for them to select, they had to resort to actually selecting to docks, in which it was observed that almost every fish that was found on the southern end was under a dock. And so this could be a big problem. But once those fish actually left during the spring, and there were hardly any fish on the southern half of the reservoir for summer and fall, we actually found that there was no selection really for, and there's typically an avoidance for fish for the artificial habitat throughout those 2 seasons. So just kind of a recap of what we found. We found that fish did display a little movement, and this is a big issue when trying to capture these fish with trap nets, with gill nets, as these passive fisheries collecting equipment typically rely on large movements of fish in order to get caught. And if these muskellunges, during, like even perhaps during the summer when they had these really small home ranges, there's not a lot of movement going on there, and it would be very difficult for these fish to actually get caught in trap nets and stuff like that if they're not moving. So this creates a big problem, and definitely some other techniques for trying to collect these juvenile fish needs to be investigated more. And also, as a result of lower movements, there were small home ranges. The fish were very, very selective on certain coves and really just did not move much at all. And also we found that timber is a big important factor for this reservoir, and most reservoirs actually, and that the fish will heavily and definitely select timber in the Eagle Creek Reservoir. So from a management implication, what kind of, for the DNR, what kind of impact would this have? And in Eagle Creek reservoirs, there's definitely a lack of submerged vegetation, and submerged vegetation, weed line, which we all know muskies being this lion weight predator and neat ambushing points. They definitely need this this type of habitat, and with Eagle Creek and having a lack of that, this could definitely create a problem in establishing and providing protection for these younger fish. And one of the reasons for this lack of vegetation, this submerged vegetation in the reservoir, would be simply a result of common carp, as they typically like to feed and root in the sediment. And by rooting in the sediment, they're actually dispensing or suspending a lot of that sediment into the water column and not allowing light to reach the bottom and allow macrophytes or aquatic vegetation to grow. And that's a big factor. And as a DNR, they are trying to control these, so they definitely know this is a big issue. And also, this limited habitat is, again, a big issue. There is only 4.2% of the reservoir is suitable habitat for these fish. So this can actually be corrected by possibly adding brush piles, and there are some hoops that need to be jumped through, but you can actually add habitat to the reservoir and reduce this competition, and ultimately, hopefully, encourage these muskie to stay in the reservoirs, as they are going upstream. There's even a lot of fishermen have even reported catching 20-inch muskie even in Eagle Creek below the dam. So this is a big issue, and really makes this really difficult for the DNR to actually really establish and get their money's worth out of stocking these fish in the reservoir. And finally, and just for other reservoirs, just not Eagle Creek specifically, if any kind of agency or anyone's going to be stocking a muskie into a reservoir or any kind of thing, habitat should be heavily considered for this before stocking, as yet again competition will play a big key role in this. But however, even though Eagle Creek does possibly have a habitat issue, the DNR should not suspend stocking or change any stocking procedures, as muskie typically can take sometimes as many as 10 years to actually establish a good adult population that can actually be sampled and managed. So the DNR still has a little bit of time to wait, and before these fish can actually be fully analyzed and looked at before making any kind of major changes in stocking procedures. However, it probably wouldn't hurt to actually stock the fish on the northern end of the reservoir, as opposed to actually stocking on the southern boat ramp by the dam, as they are known to go through the dam. So this might save a few by stocking on the northern end, and plus allow them to get to habitat faster and allow them to seek protection and establish a home range quicker. So with that, I have a lot of people to thank. It's not easy doing this, and I need a lot of people's help. I first off thank Sadie Clark-Colax of the Indiana DNR. She helped coordinate with the hatchery and help actually surgically implant the tags into the fish. I also thank Jason Dahl, he's a grad student at Ball State. I also think Amanda Green, Nick Harms, Zach Prowse, and Anna Settenary, they're also students at Ball State who helped me with tracking, helped me with recording data, and had some long nights sometimes tracking these fish. Yeah, they enjoy it. So, and I also thank the Indiana Department of Natural Resources, as they provided the receiver for tracking these fish and also the fish. And I also thank Ball State University for funding this project. And I also thank Indy Parks and Recreation for allowing us to use a bigger boat over the 10 horsepower limit in the reservoir, and having access to the gravel pit in order to track those other fish that left. And with that, I'll take any questions, and thank you.
A couple questions. One, how big should the original stock muskies be by now, and what's the average depth on the south of the causeway versus north of the causeway?
The average fish, they should be around legal size limits. They should be at least 36 inches, theoretically. And the average depth on the northern half is, off the top of my head, it is 11 feet, and the southern half is 19 and a half.
And can you get to that quarry from the lake? I guess I didn't realize.
It's actually blocked off, but when it rains and there's a big flood event, there's a little bitty bridge. It's about that wide, and that's the only way we could actually suspect that they got into the reservoir. Yeah, and those two fish that actually were in the reservoir remained, or in the gravel pit, actually remained in the gravel pit the rest of the tracking period until tracking ended.
Nick, you're able. It does not matter the depth of the fish. You would still be able to pick them up via the telemetry.
With these tags, they had a max depth of 35 feet before your range of picking them up actually starts to become reduced. So we could actually pick up the fish from a half-mile away.
Wow.
Is there a concern with Eagle Creek with dissolved oxygen? Because I know that they put other species in there. Striped bass was one, walleye, northern pike, and they have not been successful in Eagle Creek. And so, the question from the DNR management point of view is, what's wrong with this lake?
Yeah.
And so, I guess that's the same question. You know, is this a good lake to continue stocking there?
It could be. It's just until when established population should be established by, or balanced fishery should become established in the reservoir, then we could actually analyze that. So, but right now it's just still too early in the game to really find out or just see if these fish are actually doing well. But just they seem to, in some cases, not like the reservoir, and they tend to like to leave it sometimes, it appears. So it could be something other than habitat, but it was just something that was not really looked at specifically in this study. But
okay, and what about the dissolved oxygen?
And it's always a definite big concern, as during the summer and winter kills are very common. So as a water supply, they are very limited on what they can do with adjusting the dissolved oxygen and trying to encourage that. And I'm not sure how the dam behaves at Eagle Creek, but a lot of dams for a lot of reservoirs will actually release water at lower depths in order to get that when the thermocline formation actually starts, that it can actually get that lower oxygen water out of the reservoir and keep the higher oxygen content up higher in the water column in the reservoir. So, but I'm pretty sure Eagle Creek is just kind of a spillway, or has the middle depth flow for the dam.
Nick, you mentioned that was it confirmed that they had gone over the dam via the telemetry, or just suspected?
It was suspected. We tried to gain access to it, but due to liability issues and private property, we were unable to actually physically track. But there were actually quite a few anglers who actually sent me pictures because of the blog, and they were sending pictures of actual fish that were not even 20 inches, 18, 19 inches.
So it's plausible that if they do go over the dam, that they can survive.
Yeah.
Okay. Over the years, now and again, there'll be like an algae bloom or something over there, and the water is foul, smelling, tasting.
Yeah.
Does that have any impact on?
It very well could. It could definitely influence behavior, if anything, if it doesn't really affect the oxygen content or anything like that. But it would definitely influence behavior, movement, and if they're moving around, they very well could get preyed on by fish. They could go over the dam.
there any recommendations on how to improve the reservoir with habitat? You mentioned brush piles, some
yeah.
other things.
Brush piles, you can even, it's really outlawed now, but they used to add tires, fish cribs, and there's a variety of ways they can actually do that in improving the habitat.
Okay. Such as?
Just throwing in brush piles, pretty much. Just that's because you really can't grow trees in there again. So the only real option would actually just be manipulating the habitat by adding it.
Okay. Is that allowed?
If you get permits, you can actually do it.
Okay.
So you have to go through like parks and recreation, but you can actually, if they approve it, like anyone can add habitat to the reservoir.
Just a dumb idea. Every year around the 1st of January, all the little communities around here gather up all these Christmas trees and evergreen trees and stuff. And I'm wondering, what's the possibility of gathering those things and somehow tying them together and dumping them in?
Yeah, with the proper permits, you can definitely do that. They prefer a hardwood, and when
They're going to rot out.
Yeah,
in a
so
while.
yeah, they don't rot out. Yeah, but yeah, that could be, if you get all the permits, you can definitely do that.
That's a pretty common thing up in Wisconsin. You come out when the ice is there, so
Yeah,
the ice melts, you sink, and you got ribs.
Yeah. Do you have a question?
You know, are a lot of the muskies that are going up the river, I mean, what's the chances that they're looking for habitat because that river's full of timber?
Yeah, they very well. And every time they were actually tracked, we always found them in a pool by a fallen tree, and there was actually vegetation, a lot of vegetation, such that there were a bunch of smartweeds that were actually along the shoreline, and they were none of the 6 were actually anywhere near them. They were all up under hollowed out log or something, and they were all tucked up underneath there in about 3 feet of water. So I guess we could start waiting for muskies now. It sounds like Eagle Creek.
What about adding aquatic vegetation to the reservoir? How does that work?
Again, it's permits, but you can actually definitely do it. And since Eagle Creek is actually a water supply, they have to keep levels fairly regulated. They can't have a lot of drawdown anymore. So this generally creates a problem for some aquatic vegetation, as they'll have sometimes during the winter when the water is drawn down, they'll be exposed in the dirt and the soil. But with Eagle Creek, the water levels are typically kept constant, and this would actually allow for a better vegetation take. So it would definitely be a possibility, as with being exposed to the air during the winter, it actually kills them some. But yes, it's definitely a possibility.
Well, Nick, thanks so much for
Thank you for having me.
coming and speaking to us. Any other questions?